going to back up a little bit, and we're going to start on Chum Beis and Beis 22b, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines up from the bottom, Hamar Ula. Just so we get a little bit of the context here. So remember again, the Gemara ended off with one of the dominant pieces on Chum Beis and Beis was the position of the Ziknei Darim, where the Gemara identifies ultimately as the elders of the south. So bottom line, right before that, Amar Ula, so the Gemara ended off by saying, Elakasavri shochtin v'zarkin al tamei sheretz. That Ziknei Darim ultimately came out with this idea that the halacha is that one could shech the Karban Pesach on behalf of someone who had become tamei through Tumas Sheretz. That was the position of the Ziknei Darim. Again, that's one piece of their shita, as we'll develop more. But they paskin that one could go ahead and shech the Karban Pesach on behalf of someone who had become tamei with Tumas Sheretz. Now the Gemara says, Amar Ula. Ula said, Amar Ula, Takaluhu Reish Lakish l'diramai. Reish Lakish raised an objection ultimately to the position of the Ziknei Darim. V'chi eza koach meruba. Who has a greater koach? Koach mechaprin or koach miskaprin? Is it the koach ultimately again of those who are mechaper, i.e. the kohanim, or those who are miskaprin, those who receive atonement? Heve omer, koach miskaprin. So I would say ultimately again, those who receive the kapara have stronger ability than those who give the kapara or the vehicle for a kapara. Uma b'makom shenitmu bailim b'sheretz mishalchin karbanos saying, if that's the case, says Ula, really says Reish Lakish, in a situation where the owners became tamei tumas sheretz, so according to you, Ziknei Darim mishalchin karbanos saying, they still have the ability to send their karbanos to be offered. Kohen shenitma b'sheretz eno meratza. Then again, yet we see that a Kohen who becomes tamei b'tumas sheretz doesn't have the ability to go ahead and actually offer up the carbon. Therefore, in that case, makom shenitmu ubailim b'meis she'in mishalchin karbanos saying that in the case of tumas meis, according to what we're saying now, is that the bailim don't have the ability to send off, they offer up their karbanos. In other words, if the owners themselves became tamei tumas meis, excuse me, they do not have the ability to offer up their karbanos. Kohen shenitma b'meis eno din she'el meratza. Then certainly again a kohen who himself becomes tumas meis, certainly he does not have the ability to effect atonement. To which the Gemara says, Kasavrei Ziknei Darim tamei meis nami mishaleach karbanos. So we'll say, to which the Gemara says something dramatically amazing, which is according to the Ziknei Darim, they hold that even if a person contracted tumas meis, he still has the ability to send his carbon to the Beis HaMikdash. So even if the Yisrael is tamei tumas meis, he has the ability to send that carbon to the Beis HaMikdash, and it can be offered up on his behalf. But says Gemara, 1 second, how can you say that? And I will say, no, understand, the test ground for a lot of this is carbon Pesach. So what the Ziknei Darim seem to be saying right now is that even if the owner, even if the bailim is tamei, now again we said tumas sheretz before, now we're even saying that even if he's tamei tumas meis, he has the ability to offer up his karban pesach. When I say has the ability to offer up his karban pesach, what that means is that if I, a Yisrael, want to go ahead and offer my karban pesach, but I am tamei tumas meis, so it sounds like the Ziknei Darim are saying that I can still have my carbon offered up on my behalf in the Beis HaMikdash. And you understand the incredible novelty of that. If I'm tamei tumas meis, so first I'm not coming anywhere near the Beis HaMikdash, but more importantly, what? I can't eat anything. So watch this. So the Gemara says, Kasarve Ziknei Darim tamei meis naim shaleach karbanosa. The Gemara says, really? V'haksiv ish kiya tamei v'asa pesach b'chodes hasheni. But 1 second. We'll say the reason why that doesn't make sense is because the Torah provides a mechanism for someone who is tamei to go ahead and offer up their karban pesach when a month later on Pesach Sheni. So we'll say the fact that the Torah provides a mechanism to go ahead and bring the karban pesach in the event that you are tamei tumas meis by Pesach Rishon would seem to indicate to us what? That someone who is tamei tumas meis cannot offer up Pesach, cannot offer up Karban Pesach, to which the Gemara says, Le mitzvah. So the Gemara said, this is actually quite interesting. So apparently, according to the Ziknei Darim, this idea that someone who is tamei tumas meis cannot offer up their Karban Pesach and Pesach Rishon, that's Le mitzvah. But the mitzvah means what? L'chatchila. L'chatchila, if you are tamei tumas meis, you cannot go ahead and offer it up on Pesach Rishon. You should avail yourself of Pesach Sheni. But in the event that you sent your carbon to be offered on Pesach Rishon, then what? Ex post facto, b'di'eved, it will work. I b'haksiv. But there's another pasuk that says ish. We'll say top of Chav Gimel. Ish lefi achlo. And we'll say 1 second. The pasuk by Karban Pesach says ish lefi achlo, which sounds like what? Which sounds like in order to be able to offer up the Karban Pesach, you have to be able to eat the Karban Pesach. And yet, apparently, clearly in this case over here, where the individual is Tamei Tumas Meis, he obviously cannot eat the Karban Pesach, to which the Gemara says again, L'mitzvah. The mitzvah, L'chatchila, you should be able to eat the Karban Pesach, but b'di'eved, even if you can't eat the Karban Pesach, i.e. your Tamei Tumas Meis, you can still have the Karban offered up on your behalf, and the Karban is good. So the Gemara says, L'ikuvelo, are you telling me now that the ability to consume Karban Pesach is not makif? Suppose say, this is very dramatic because it seems to fly in the face of everything we know about Karban Pesach. So according to Ziknei Daram, what we're now saying is that it's only lechatchila that you have to be able to eat Karban Pesach. B'di'eved, if you are tamei in a way that you cannot consume the Karban, if though lechatchila you should wait until Pesach Sheni, if you didn't and you offered it up on Pesach Rishon, the Karban is still good. Gemara says, is that true? That the ability to eat Karban Pesach is not ma'akev? In other words, I will say that the ability to eat Karban Pesach is not one of the determinants of your ability to offer it up. Vatanya, but you learned in a brayso, b'michsas nefashos, Shabbos say, the pasuk says, b'michsas nefashos, which literally means, in accordance with Rashi says, b'michsas loshon minyan. B'michsas means in accordance with the number. So b'michsas nefashos, melamed, she'ein ha-pesach nishchat, elosh ela l'menuya. We'll say that teaches us that what? Karban Pesach can only go ahead and be slaughtered for those who are counted as part of the Pesach. Remember, again, one of the unique ideas about Karban Pesach is that you have to be part of a chabura. You have to be counted as part of a group prior to the time of the shechita. So michsas, so the lashon of here is v'yima tabayis mios misa v'lakachu u'shcheno akarov el beiso b'michsas nefashos ish lefi achlo tachosu alaseh. So the halacha Rabbi say is that you have to be counted as part of a chabura at the time the Pesach is shechted. Shena Pesach nishchat ela lemenuyav shachto shelo lemenuyav. We'll say, what happens if the Karban Pesach was shechted and it was to be consumed by people who were not counted as part of the chabura at the time of the shechita? Yachol yeheka over ala mitzvah. So you might have thought ultimately again that what? That maybe you could still eat it after the fact. And again, it's only the chatchila that you have to be part of a chabura. But if you weren't counted as part of the chabura, it's okay. B'di'eved you could eat it. Talmud lomar tachosu. Therefore, we'll say the pasuk uses another lashon of tachosu. In other words, it says b'michsas nefashos ish lefi achlo tachosu alaseh. 2 times the Torah uses this phrase, you have to be counted. Shana alav akosov, shana alav la'akev. Both sides, the Torah uses the word b'michsas and tachosu, which is the same shorish that you have to be counted, and uses that word twice. Why does it use that word twice? I both said to teach you that what? That it's ma'akev. That halacha l'maisa, you can only partake of the Karban Pesach if what? If you are counted as part of the chabura at the time of the shechita. But if you are not counted as part of the chabura at the time of the shechita, then what? You may not partake of the Karban Pesach. Now watch this. Ve'iskish ochlin lemenuyin. And Rabbi say we have a hekish between consumption of the Karban Pesach and being counted as part of the Karban Pesach. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says ve'iskish ochlin lemenuyin ma menuyin ma'akvi. Rabbi say just as in order to eat at the Karban Pesach, you have to be counted as part of the chabura at the time of the shechita. Af ochlin ma'akvi. So to Rabbi say the ability to actually eat the Karban Pesach is ma'akiv as well. Shimshachtu l'tmeim ula areilim v'chola v'zakin shen yachol lechol kizayis pasel va'afilu hein minuyin dehalafi achlo b'haykra ksiv legabi minur. So we'll say, watch this. So the pasuk ultimately again discusses achila and tachosu in the same pasuk. Torah tells me that there are 2 things that are ma'aki by Karban Pesach. Number 1, you have to be counted, i.e. you have to be part of the chabura at the time of the shechita. And if you are not counted as part of the chabura at the time of the shechita, you can't partake of the Karban. Not only that, but achila is also mentioned. Achila means your ability to consume. So what do we see from here? The iskish ochlin leminuyin, which also means in the same way you have to be counted, you have to have the ability to eat the carbon. Same way that if you were in a counter, you can't eat. So too, if you can't eat, it's ma'akev. You can't be yotzi the mitzvah. We'll say, what are cases where you can't eat? There are a variety of cases. A person can be too sick to eat, a person can be too ill to eat, or a person can be tamei. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, if you cannot actively partake of the carbon pesach, you are not yotze. Well, here's the problem. The problem is Ziknei Daram just said that what? That even if you are tamei, even though l'chatchila you should wait till Pesach Sheni, but b'diavad you could still go ahead and send your carbon pesach for Pesach Rishon. So we'll say, so what do we do with this? Says the Gemara, don't worry. Ziknei Daram lamakshi. Okay, we'll say, Gemara seems to give a simple answer. Ziknei Daram do not make that hekish. The Ziknei Daram do not make the comparison between Minuyin and Achila. They do not make the comparison between Tachosu and Achila. Okay? V'chilo makshi nami meha, nami islu pircha. But even if the Ziknei Daram do not make that hekish in the pasuk between Minuyin and Achila, there's still another issue. What's the other issue? Uma b'makom shenitmu bailim b'sheretz. So we'll say in the case of where the owner of the carbon became tamei tuma sheretz. So the Ziknei Daram said, Hashem b'shalchen carbon saying lechatchila. So we'll say in the case of where the owners became tamei b'tuma sheretz, lechatchila we still permit them to send the carbon to the base of Mikdash to be shechted on their behalf. Kohen shenitma b'sheretz eno meratza. Yet I will say in that very same case, a Kohen who became tamei tuma sheretz, I will say does not have the ability to perform the avoda. Therefore, makom shenitmu ubailim b'meis, that in a case where the owners of the carbon became tamei tumas meis, she'im mishalchen carbon osein lechatchila, would I will say even the Ziknei Daram agree that what? When the bailim became tamei tumas meis, even the Ziknei Daram agree the lechatchila they shouldn't be sending the carbon. Right? Let's use the Karban Pesach as the example. Even Ziknei Daram agree that if the bailim are tamei tumas meis, they shouldn't send the carbon lechatchila. They should wait for what? Pesach Sheni. It's only ex post facto. If they did it, that they yotze. So in a case of makom shenitu bailim b'meis shem mishal carbon osein lechatchila, therefore kohen shenitma b'meis ein of din shenim meratza. Then I will say certainly in that case where a kohen became tamei tumas meis, certainly he does not have the ability to affect the tumah. So I'll say this still seems to share ultimately again the Ziknei Daram, to which the Gemara says Meisvei. The Gemara is another kasha. Mipnei sha'amru nazir va'osa pesach. We'll say this is actually an interesting case. The Gemara is quoting over here, interesting brayso. Mipnei sha'amru because they said nazir va'osa pesach, a nazir, and one who goes ahead and performs the carbon pesach, hatzitz meratza al tumas dam, ve'in hatzitz meratza al tumas haguf. So we'll say the tzitz, which refers ultimately again to the plate that is worn on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol, which has the ability to affect atonement for certain parts of the sacrificial service that were done with tumah. So watch this. The tzitz is meratz al tumas dam. So we'll say, we're going to talk about this more in depth, but the tzitz is essentially, what the tzitz does, I will say, is that if at any point in time during the sacrificial service, something inadvertently became tamei, the tzitz allows for essentially the tzitz says that the carbon could still be effective. That's what it means when it says the tzitz is meratza. So the tzitz is meratza if the dam, or dam means the blood, but it means any part of the sacrificial service becomes tamei, or any part of the carbon becomes tamei, the tzitz is meratza. What the tzitz doesn't work for is tumas haguf. So we'll say what that sounds like is as follows. The tzitz, we'll say, essentially the tzitz could fix if some part of the carbon became disqualified. But if some part of the Kohen, in other words, if the Kohen himself becomes tamei, or what we're saying over here is tumas haguf, someone is actually tamei tumas haguf, for that the tzitz is not meratza. So the Gemara says, b'mai. Now what does that mean? Ilema b'tumas sheretz. So if you want to tell me that, what it means is as follows. That we're dealing with tumas sheretz, that someone contracted sheretz tumah, ha'amrit shochtin v'zarkin al tumas sheretz. So we said before that what? That if the owner of the carbon contracts tumas sheretz, then what? We could still go ahead and offer up the carbon. That's the Ziknei Daram. Then even if the owner of the carbon contracted tumas sheretz, he can still offer up the carbon. To which the Gemara says, Ela tumas meis. Rather, we must be talking about where someone contracted tumas meis. V'katani ein hatzitz meratza. And yet, what did we just say, Rabosai? That if someone, we'll discuss who the someone is, contracted tumas meis, then the tzitz cannot affect atonement for that carbon. Alma, what do you see from here? Nitmu'u bailim b'meis. That I will say, if the owners contracted tumas meis, ein mishalchen karbanos seyin, that they cannot send their karbanos to the Beis Hamikdash to be offered up. So I will say this seems to pose a contradiction to Ziknei Darim. So Ziknei Darim were saying that even if the bailim became tamei, they could still go ahead and send their karbanos to be offered. This sounds like over here that the tzitz would only be meratza if some part of the carbon became disqualified. But if the owners themselves are disqualified how? Because they contracted tumas meis, they cannot send their karbanos. To which the Gemara says, lo. So we'll say, if at the end of the day, if it were talking about a case of where the owners contracted tumas meis, you absolutely can go ahead and still send the carbon. I will say, remember again, even the Ziknei Darim will agree that if the owners became tamei tumas meis l'chatchila, ideally it's best not to send the carbon. It's only what? It's only b'diavad. If they did it, that it'll still work. What's the case over here? Hachamay askinon kegon shenitma kohen b'sheretz. We'll say, what's the case that the Bryce is discussing? The case Bryce is discussing is where the kohen himself became tamei tumas sheretz. So therefore, again, ihachi, if that's the case, ema seifa nitma tumas hatahom hatzitz miratze. We'll say, now watch this. But yet, look at the sefer of that brisa. The sefer of that brisa says that if he becomes tamei with tumas hatom, so we'll say we're going to discuss what this means in just a moment. But for our purposes, in this statement, tumas hatom will say refers to any tumah which was until this point in time unknown. No one knew about this tumah, and suddenly it's the tumah literally means tumah of the depth. Just like no one knows what's in the depths. This is a case of tumah that up until this point was unknown. So watch this. We're going to define that in just a moment. So nitma tumas hatahom, if he becomes tamei, tumas hatahom hatzitz miratze. The tzitz has the ability to affect atonement for that level of tumah. So I'll say, so what type of tumas hatahom are we dealing with? Hatani Rabbi Chia. Lo amru tumas hatahom ela lemeis bilvad. We'll say when we speak about tumas hatahom, that's referring to tumas hatahom of tumas meis. So we'll say if you look at Rashi says over here lo amru duhutra tumas hatahom benazir va'osa pesach ela betumas hameis bilvad. So we'll say the simple case of this would be where, let's say again, a person comes in contact with a corpse and no one ever knew there was a corpse there. You find the corpse, buried underneath whatever it is, a pile of something. No one ever knew that there was a corpse there. Suddenly, again, the individual comes in contact with that corpse. That's called tumas hatom. What the Gemara is suggesting is as follows. Watch this. So I'm asking, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Thank you. So when we say that tumas hatom that tzitz can be miratze for tumas hatahom. What type of tumah is that? That's tumas meis. So the Gemara says, lemeis bilvad. Lemeis the meute mai. So when we say that the tzitz is only miratze for tumas hatom of tumas meis, what does that come to exclude? My love. So the Gemara says, lo lemeute. I'm sorry. I keep on losing the place. My love lemeute tumas hatahom disheretz. Rabbi say, is that not coming to exclude the case of tumas hatahom of sheretz? That, for example, let's say the Kohen or someone else for that matter stumbles upon tumas hatahom of sheretz. In other words, no one ever knew that there was a dead sheretz here, and the individual stumbles upon this sheretz. That's called tumas hatahom. That apparently, again, the tzitz would not be meratza for that type of tumah. To which the Gemara says, lo lemeute tumas hatahom deziva. This is quite interesting. No, rather it comes to exclude that the tzitz is not meratza for tumas hatahom of ziva. Now again, the paradigmatic case of tumas hatahom, or I should say, the general case of tumas hatahom is what? You stumble upon tumah that you did not know about before. So I understand that in the context of mace, and I understand that in the context of sheretz. What I don't understand that in the context of is what? Ziva. Also remember again, zav refers to an emission. What's the tumas hatahom of zav? It's actually quite interesting. Take a look at Rashi. Tumas hatom de ziva. It's in the wide lines, about 5 lines in. Tumas hatom de ziva kigon ra'a bin hashmashos. Safek kula min hayom, o kula min halayla, ve'in kan el riyah achas safek chetzem min hayom, ve'chetzem min halayla, v'havi le'kishtei riyos. So listen to this. So the halacha is, if a zav has one emission, he just goes to go ahead and observe the rest of that day b'tara. If a zav has two emissions, he has to go ahead and observe Shiva Nekiyim, 7 clean days. The interesting case I will say is what happens if a zav has a re'iyah that spans ben hashmashos. So we'll say, what's the suffix over here? Ben hashmashos in general is a suffix, is it day or is it night? If a zav has a re'iyah that spans ben hashmashos or has an emission that spans ben hashmashos, we'll say, so what's the suffix? The suffix is, how do we view that re'iyah? Do we view that that's a re'iyah that occurred on one day, or is that a re'iyah that occurred on 2 days? If it occurred on 2 days, he now has to go ahead and observe Shiva Nekiyim. So we'll say the Gemara calls that Tumas Hatahom of Ziva. Because we'll say essentially Tumas Hatahom is any Tumah that you never knew about. There's a little bit of a different application. Here, the individual is experiencing this emission that spans a Ben Hashmashos period, and therefore we do not know what the status of it is. To which the Gemara says, and therefore the Gemara seems to say that that type of Tumah, the tzitz would not be meratzeh for it. But that which Rabbi Chama asked before, Kohen hameratzeh bekarban oseim, hutralo tumas hatahom, olo hutralo tumas hatahom. But we'll say that's what Rabbi Chama asked before. That if you have a Kohen hameratzeh bekarban oseim, that if you have a Kohen ultimately again, who is coming to affect kapar through their karbanos, hutralo tumas hatahom, or lo hutralo tumas hatahom, ultimately again I will say, when we say that there might be a heter for the bailim for Tumas HaTahom, does that same heter apply to the Kohen who is offering up the karbanos or not? I was about to say, when we say that Tumas HaTahom is meratzah ultimately for the bailim, for the owners of the karban, is that same tzitz meratzah for the Tumas HaTahom for a Kohen as well? In other words, let's say the Kohen comes in contact with Tumas HaTahom, is the tzitz meratzah? To which the Gemara says, look at Rashi for just a moment. Kohen hamaratzah b'karban oseim shel nazir va'oseh pesach hutralo tumas hatom nitmas. So we'll say, up until now the Bryce was talking about if the owners of these karbanos came in contact with tumas hatahom, we now said that the tzitz is meratzah for that. What if it's not the owners? What if it's the Kohen? Or what if it is the owners, but it's also the Kohen who comes in contact with tumas hatahom? Is the tzitz able to meratzah for the Kohen as well? Tiv shot the tumas hatahom hutralo. So we can prove from here that what? That Tumas HaTahom is chutra by the Kohen as well. Ta'acha beKohen kanina. Because we'll say here we have to be dealing with the Kohen. To which the Gemara says, the Rami Bar Chama vadei pligi. Ultimately, again, because Rami Bar Chama is we'll say arguing on that which we stated above. Tashma. So we'll say again, so now what we're trying to understand is the license of a Kohen to operate when he himself has also come in contact with Tumas HaTahom. So Tashma. V'nason Aaron es avon hakodoshim. So we'll say the pasuk says this is talking about the power of the tzitz to atone. So the pasuk says that Aaron v'nasa Aaron es avon hakodoshim. Aaron will go. The pasuk in its entirety is v'haya ametzach Aaron. The tzitz will be on the forehead of Aaron. V'nasa Aaron es avon hakodoshim. And Aaron will literally bear on him the avon, the iniquity of the kadoshim. So what does that mean? So we'll say this pasuk is talking about the ability for the tzitz to be meratzah. This is the pasuk that talks to us about the ability for the tzitz to atone. So the Gemara says, "V'chi ezo avon no say." So ultimately, again, so we'll say first of all, look at Rashi, which is a moment before you turn the page. Rashi says, first of all, Durami Bar Chama Paligahu. Rashi says, "Ad deziknei darum humokim lahi b'tumas bailim usvira de'ein yochid tamei." So first of all, again, we'll say, remember, we're still locked in the Machlokes Bar Chama and the Ziknei Darim. The Ziknei Darim are telling us that a Tamei Mace or a Tamei Sheretz could offer up a Karban Pesach, because the Ziknei Darim are of the opinion that what? That you could offer up Karban Pesach even if what? Even if you can't eat it. I will say an incredible Chiddush. Rabbi Bar Chama, by the way, it's not just Rabbi Bar Chama, it's everyone else besides the Ziknei Darim hold that no. Then halacha l'maaseh, in order to offer up a Karban Pesach, what do you have to do? You have to be able to eat that carbon. If you can't eat it, you can't offer it. Now, I'll say the Gemara is switching gears for just a moment. The Gemara is asking, okay, let's talk about the tzitz for just a moment. So the pasuk is v'nasa Aaron b'tzitz ksiv es avon hakodoshim psul karbonos yirtzeh b'tzitz. What the Torah tells us is that the tzitz on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol has the ability to affect atonement for certain psulim in karbanos. Our shaila is, what is the tzitz meratzeh for? V'chi eza avanoseh amud beis in pigul hari kvar nemar lo yichashev. So we'll say, if you're going to tell me that the tzitz ultimately is meratzeh for pigul, we'll say again, remember, what's pigul? Pigul is that the kohen, when he's doing one of the avodas, he has in mind for what? To consume the carbon at a later time. So for example, again, he has in mind to consume the carbon 3 days later. That's pigul. So if you want to tell me that's what? That the tzitz is meratzeh for pigul, that can't be, and I'll tell you why. Hare kvar ne'emar lo yichashev. The pasuk already tells me that lo yichashev, Rabbi means this carbon will not be counted, which is another way of saying that what? It's possible. So again, so tzitz cannot go ahead and be machsher pigul. Im avon nosar. If you want to say that the tzitz is meratzeh, I'll say for nosar. What's nosar? Any carbon left over past its prescribed time. You want to tell me that the tzitz is meratzeh for that? No, doesn't work either. Kvar ne'emar lo yiratzeh. The pasuk says it shall not be accepted. So both say, so we already established, so what we're doing is, we already see now, tzitz cannot go ahead and affect tone, and cannot go ahead and be machshir. Right? It can't be machshir pigul, it can't be machshir nosar, so what does it do? Ha eno nosei, ela avon tuma, shehutra michlala b'tzibor. Ooh, this is very interesting. So both say, what does the tzitz do? The tzitz could ultimately, again, allow, or I should say permit, or be machshir, the type of tumah which is already permitted b'tzibor. Rabbi say, so what does this mean? What the Gemara is suggesting over here is that the tzitz has the ability to go ahead and permit something which is permitted b'tzibor. Look at Rashi for just a moment. So the Gemara says, Rashi says, ha'ino no say, ha kilomar ha kine matzino she'ino no say ela avon tumah. V'yeshtam ledavar lite nesias psul kachim zal tumah al tumah hoilu matzino la heter acher shehutra michala b'tzibor lechatchila hilchach yachid shlo hutra etzlo yavu atzitz v'yiratze b'devet. So we'll say, watch this. So before we clean this Rashi, my tumah. So we'll say, so here's what we have. So we know that tzitz is meratza, which means that tzitz permits something. So what does the tzitz permit? Can't permit pigul, Torah says that's already asur. Can't permit nosar, Torah says it's asur. So the Gemara says, my tumah. So what type of tumah? Ilema mitumas sheretz. So if you want to say that the tzitz allows for, let's say the owner was tamei tumas sheretz, and it was offered up in a state of tumah. So if you want to say that the tzitz is meratzeh for that, so we'll say, so heicha ishtari. So we'll say, ultimately, do we ever find the case of where tumas sheretz is hutra b'tzibor? Do we ever find the case that if the tzibor is tamei tumas sheretz, that ultimately what? We allow carbon tzibor to be offered? So the answer to that is no. So what's the only case, I will say, where we see a tumah that is permitted b'tzibor? Ella tumas meis. So we'll say, what's the case of where we see tumah that is hutra b'tzibor? That's a case of tumas meis. So we'll say, now what does that case refer to? The paradigmatic case that we'll say is, let's say everyone is tamei tumas meis by Pesach. What's the halacha? The halacha is that we allow, if the tzibor, which means 51% of the congregation, is tamei tumas meis, then the laws of tumah are hutra. The laws of tumah are suspended. And we offer up the carbon Pesach in a state of tumah. What the Gemara is suggesting over here is as follows: that what the tzitz is meratzeh for is something for which we already have a precedent for allowing. We'll say, what's a type of tumah for which we already have a precedent to allow a carbon to be offered up in a state of tumah? I should say it differently. What's the type of tumah for which we already have a precedent that you could offer up a carbon in this? What's the type of tumah for which there is already a precedent to be matir? And the answer is tumas meis. Therefore, I will say the Gemara assumes that the tzit is going to be meratzah for tumas meis, and ultimately again bima. Elo tumas meis. V'lav kigon shenitmu bailim b'meis. We'll say, and it must be that what? It must be that the case of where the tzitz is meratzah is what type of case? Where the owners ultimately again were tamei. They sent their carbon to the Beis Hamikdash to be offered. we could, even though lechatchila we don't want to offer up such a carbon, but if they sent it, we could offer it up. Why? Because the tzitz is meratzeh for such a carbon. How do we know the tzitz is meratzeh for that type of tumah? Because that's the type of tumah for which we already have precedent. Because you know that when the tzibur itself is tamei tumas meis, the laws of tumah are suspended. Alma nitmu bailim b'meis mishalchin carbon osein. So what do you see from here? Where the owners ultimately again are tamei tumas meis, they have the ability to still send their karbanos to the Beis Hamikdash to be offered up. Ubimai. So we'll say, what type of carbon are we talking about over here? Ibn Nazir. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. So now what we're trying to figure out is as follows. So now we'll say, so this is actually quite interesting. What we've done is, what the Gemara has just done, is the Gemara has developed that there is a heter, and the Gemara now has told me where the heter applies. In other words, so we'll say, what's the heter? That there seems to be that in a case where the owners are tamei tumas meis, lechatchila should they be sending a carbon to the Beis Hamikdash? No. But if they did, does it work? Yes. Why does it work? Because the tzitz is meratzeh. So we'll say, so now we've dealt with heteris. Now what's the challenge? What's the case? Say, Ibn Nazir, if you want to tell me, we'll say that this is a case of a Nazir who's tamei tumas meis, who lechatchila should not be sending his karbanos to the Beis Hamikdash. But if he did, and it's offered up, they work. Why? Because the tzitz is meratzeh. So I'll tell you why that can't be. V'chiyamos meis alav amrachmana. So we'll say, here's the problem. If the Nazir is tamei tumas meis, then what Rabbi say? He's not sending his karbanos naziros. Why is he not sending his karbanos naziros, Rabbi say? Because what happens if a Nazir becomes tamei tumas meis? The whole naziros is shattered, and he has to start all over again. So it can't be a case of Nazir, ella la'osei Pesach. So we'll say the case where this must come up is where the Karban Pesach, the owner of the Karban Pesach, Rabbi say, is what? Is tamei tumas meis. Lechatchila, he shouldn't be sending his Karban Pesach to the Beis Hamikdash, but if he does and it's offered up, it still works because the tzitz is meratzeh. V'la'av kigon shenitmu bailim b'meis. So we'll say, so you see, so this seems to be a rat, this seems to be a raya to the ziknei daram. And we'll say on a variety of levels. First of all, number one, that we see that there's a case where the owners become tamei, and even though again they are tamei, they can still send their carbon. The carbon is offered up. The tzitz is meratzeh. In addition, by Karban Pesach, we now see another novelty according to the Ziknei Darim, which is what? They can't eat it. They can't eat it, and even though they can't eat it, Rabbi says Ziknei Darim paskin at what? Then Allah Chalamaisa the achila is not ma'aki by Karban Pesach. The Gemara says no. So the Gemara says the olam b'sheretz. The case Rabbi says is not that it became tumai tumas meis. Rather, what's the case? The case is b'sheretz, v'shem tuma ba'olam. So what's happening over here is the license is only not if the owners became tamei tumas meis. Only if they became tamei. Ultimately, again, what was the lower form of tumas sheretz. If the owners became tamei tumas sheretz, then they can go in and send their carbon to the Beis Hamikdash to be offered up on their behalf. But what does it mean that ultimately, again, we find this type of tumah hutra b'tzibur, b'shem tumah bi'olam? We'll say that lashon of the Gemara says is that there is a type of tumah that is hutra b'tzibur, right? Ultimately, again, literally is yesh min tumah. Rashi says yesh min tumah hutra b'tzibur. That's ultimately again the type. That's tumas meis. That's tumas meis. However, again, tumas sheretz is not hutra b'tzibur, but the Gemara is both said. See what the Gemara is doing is as follows. The Gemara is trying to speak in generalities about tumah, but then ultimately trying to find the specific case. So we do the general, what we call shem tumah ba'olam. The concept of tumah is hutra b'tzibur. What type of tumah is hutra b'tzibur? That's tumas meis. But it happens to be that this particular case that we're referring to over here is not tumas meis. Rather, it is tumas sheretz. V'ika dedayiku ma'isiyachi. Well, I say there are others. Ultimately, again, if you look at Rashi says v'shem tumah biolam. Take a look. Actually, look at the olam. It's 2, 4, 5 lines down on the wide lines of Rashi. The olam tumas sheretz ka'aminon. Rather, again, I will say when we speak about the ability of owners to be tamei and send the carbon to the Beis Hamikdash, that's not tumas meis. Rather, again, that is tumas sheretz. So the Gemara says, "Kamina mehacha ditzitz miratza lishchot velizrak al tamei sheretz v'dekakashi lecha hecha ishtari bohen." But now you can ask if we're talking about tumas sheretz. The Gemara said, but this type of tumas hutra b'tzibor it doesn't mean this exact type of tumah sheretz is hutra b'tzibor. Rather, it means what? That there are types of tumah that are hutra b'tzibor. V'shem tumah bi'olam, Rashi says, ashkecham di'ishtari b'hen, v'tayma gadol b'hen lahatel ritzoy tzitz al tumah sheretz. V'ika d'dayik u'maysi hachi. We'll say there are others who have a different deal, can interpret it this way. Avon HaKadoshim. The pasuk says that the tzitz is meratzeh on the avon HaKadoshim, on something wrong done with kodshim. So the Gemara says, Avon HaKadoshim. I'm sorry. So the Gemara says, Vika da'ik u'maysi hachi. Avon HaKadoshim. In avon kadoshim. Lo. My tumah will say, what's the case of tumah that the avon HaKadoshim, that the tzitz is meratzeh? Ileima tumas sheretz. If you want to say it's tumas sheretz, mi ishtarya b'tzibor. So both say it's tumas sheretz ever permitted b'tzibor. Ela lav tumas meis. Ultimately, Gemara, what are we referring to? Both say tumas meis. So the Gemara says, va'avon HaKadoshim in, avon HaKadoshim lo. The olam tumas sheretz, v'shem tumah b'olam. So both say the Gemara, it's a different version, but the same concept. That ultimately, again, the tzitz is meratzeh for something. What is the tzitz meratzeh for? So the Gemara now wants to suggest that Lamaisa at most the tzitz is meratzeh if the owners are tamei tumas sheretz, but not if they are tamei tumas meis. But what does it mean then when the Brisa said before, since we find a form of tumah that's hutra b'tzibor, therefore the tzitz can be meratzeh on tumah as well? What the Gemara means to say is as follows. We see conceptually that there is a form of tumah that is ultimately hutra b'tzibor. The tzitz is not meratzeh on that type of tumah, but once we see that there's a concept that the tzitz can be meratzeh on some, once we see that there's a form of tumah which can be hutra b'tzibor, that gives us the ability to say that the tzitz is meratzeh on some form of tumah. Even though the form of tumah that the tzitz is meratzeh for is not the same type of tumah, that is hutra b'tzibor. Because the type of tumah that is hutra b'tzibor, Abosai, is what? Tumas meis. And the type of tumah that the tzitz is meratzeh for is what? Tumas sheretz. So bottom line is, we leave off with this incredible machlokes between the Ziknei Daram and Rai Bar Chama. And the Shaila ultimate, so what this boils down to is as follows. It all comes down to one fundamental question, which is, what type of tumah can the owner have and still offer up their carbon, if any? And what is the tzitz meratzeh for? So so bottom line, halacha l'maisa, remember again, so what do we do? It's important to know halacha l'maisa, and Mashiach could come. Even if you're not a kohen, you can still be called upon to paskin halachas. So how do we paskin? Remember again, the Ziknei Daram advanced to us a number of dramatic shitos. What did they advance to us? First of all, the Ziknei Daram seem to paskin that halacha l'maisa, whether the owners are tamei tumas sheretz or tumas meis, they could still offer up karbanos. Even carbon pesach, which yields another dramatic position according to the Ziknei Daram, which is that according to the Ziknei Daram, carbon pesach need not be consumed by the owners b'diavad. L'chatchila, of course, they agree, but b'diavad need not be consumed. So say, how do we paskin? Get ready. I know you're on the edge of your seat for this. So we'll say, watch this. Hilchos Bias HaMikdash, Perek Beis Halacha Yud Beis. Ready? Yeah. Good. Put down the cinnamon buns. Put down this. I'm telling you, I think everybody gets caught up like in the cinnamon. I see people looking at the concentric circles like they're hypnotized. Oh, cinnamon buns. So says the guy, also listen to this. This is better. Perek Beis. Tamei sheretz kyotzebo va'arel. So we'll say the halacha is if a person is tamei tumas sheretz. Now the Rambam brings in arel. We'll get to arel separately. So I'm leaving out arel from here. Tamei tumas sheretz mishalchin es karban oseyen umakrivin aleyen. Wow. We'll say so the halacha is if a person is tamei tumas sheretz. We're going to break down tuma now. If a person is tamei tumas sheretz, they have the ability to send a karban to the base ministry. Remember again, who are we not talking about over here? I know that's a general question, right? The Kohen. We're talking over the owner. I am a Yisrael. I have to offer up a carbon. I happen to be Tamei Tumas Sheretz, but I still want to send my carbon to the Beis HaMikdash. So the Rambam Paskins, I have the ability to do that, and that carbon can be offered on my behalf. Chutz, watch this. Mi Pesach she'in shochtin osa Tamei Sheretz. The exception of Karban Pesach. Now, it makes a lot of sense. Why is Karban Pesach the exception? This is very exciting. Why is Karban Pesach the exception to this rule? Why is Karban Pesach the exception? Because you have Pesach Sheni. No, because remember again, you have recourse. This is gonna make sense in just a moment, right? Because again, remember you have recourse. The idea you have recourse, I don't have to do it as part. So first of all, it's two reasons. Number one, so leave aside the recourse. But by Pesach, the issue is I have to be able to eat. We do not pass Ziknei Darim. We paskin that in order to be Yotzei the Karban Pesach, you have to be able to eat of the Karban. If you can't eat it, you can't offer it. But leave aside Karban Pesach for just a moment. General halacha is, even if I have Tamei Tumas Sheretz, I have the ability to send a Karban to be offered up on my behalf. Aval Tamei Meis, drum roll, right? But if you're Tamei Tumas Meis, then what? Thank you. Ein makrivin alav Karban klal ad shitar. Rabbi say halacha lemaisa, if you are tamei tumas meis, we do not offer. You cannot send a Karban to be offered up on your behalf. So we'll say that is how the Rambam paskins. If you're tamei tumas sheretz, we'll let you offer up a Karban. Meaning, when I say let you offer up, meaning you could send the Karban. This is not talking about the Kohen. This is about the Yisrael. You could send the Karban, but if you are tamei tumas meis, you may not send a Karban at all. But it's not finished. Watch this. Because the Rambam in Bias HaMikdash, Perek Dalid, Halacha Tes, adds in another twist and turn. It just gets more exciting. So watch this. Dalid Tes. Called Karban She'en Kavua Lo Zman. Oh, this is interesting. So now the Rambam is going to be Mechalik. You see, in the first halacha, which was, you could write this down, in Beis Yud Beis, the Rambam was talking generalities. Generalities, if you're Tamei Tumas Sheretz, can you have a Karban offered up on your behalf? Tamei Tumas Sheretz? Yes. Tumas Meis? No. But now the Rambam in Dalit Tes gets a little bit more specific and gets now into the types of Karbanos. Kol Karban Shein Kavua Lo Zman. So I'll say if a Karban is not time bound, then what? Eino Doch Lo Asa Shabbos V'Lo Asa Tuma. So we'll say again, if the Karban is not time bound, then ultimately again there is never a need to suspend the laws of Tumah. Why? We'll leave Shabbos aside. Shim lo yikarif hayom, yikrav lamachar, ulamachar machar. Because also on a very simple level, if it's not time bound, if you can't offer it up today, then what? You'll offer it up whenever. What about v'chol karban shekavu alozman, bein karban sibor, bein karban ayachid, dochas haShabbos v'dochas haTumah. But Rabbi say ultimately again, if you have a karban that is time bound, then halacha lemaisa again, it can set aside the laws of Shabbos and the laws of Tumah. V'lo kol haTumah u'sudocha. Rabbi say Karban does not set aside all forms of Tumah, ela tumas hameis levado. Rather, the only thing it will set aside is what? It will set aside ultimately again tumas hameis. Rabbi say, so there is one. We're not going to get too into these technicalities now, but the Rambam does point out that you can have a case ultimately again where the laws of Tumah would be set aside, and that's for a Karban Sibor or for a Karban Yochid. Ultimately, again, that is kavua, that has a kavua zman, that has a set time. The Karban Pesach will be a little bit different because remember, Karban Pesach has Pesach Sheni, so Karban Pesach might be a little bit different. But where this comes up, this halacha comes up, is in certain karbanos which have to be offered up, let's say by the Kohen Gadol, or other karbanos which have a kavua zman. There are circumstances where the laws of Tumah could be set aside in order to enable the karban to be offered up. So again, even though the Rambam made a general statement, that general statement does have exceptions to its rule. But I will say, but for our purposes today, just so that you emerge with some halacha lemaisa from this sugya, so the way we paskin is halacha lemaisa, a Yisrael can have a karban offered up on his behalf if he is tamei tumas sheretz, but not if he is tamei tumas meis. Beautiful, beautiful, good. Weiter, Yoshev. So I told you, it's just good. Yoshev. So we'll say next. Remember again, we're going through the Mishnah. These are different psulim in karbanos. So what the next psul was that if the Kohen does the avoda Yoshev, so the karban is pasul. Minala and Rabbi say, how do we know that if the Kohen does the avoda in a state of yeshiv, in a state of sitting, that the karban is pasul? Amar Rafa, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Kra, la'amod l'sharis, la'amid b'charti v'lo yeshiva. All right, well, say this seems to be like pretty open and shut over here. Pasuk says la'amod u'lishares. Ultimately, again, to what? To stand, and to serve, which seems to indicate what Rabbi say that halacha l'maisa again that the avoda has to be done standing. So if you're sitting, ultimately again the amidas pasul le'amida b'charti v'lo yeshiva. You have to be standing and not sitting. Ten rabbanon la'amod l'shares. The pasuk says that what you have to stand and serve mitzvah. Rabbi say. All that, see, from that pasuk, I could say that what? I could say that halacha l'maisa, maybe standing is what Rabbi say. Mitzvah means lechatchila. Lechatchila, a person should stand. But lav dafka, that if I didn't stand, then what? Yeah, but Rabbi said, I want to be clear. See, just because the Torah says something, I know it's going to sound like a strange statement, one could interpret that statement to be a lechatchila dika statement. But b'di'evet, if you didn't do it, what the avodah is still kosher. So I might have thought that when the pasuk says la'amod l'sharis, that's a mitzvah. L'chatchila I should stand, but b'di'evet, if I didn't stand, the avodah is still kosher. Kishu omer ha'omdim. But I will say, when the Torah goes out of its way to say what? Ha'omdim sham lifnei Hashem. Torah speaks about the obligation to stand a second time. Then shana alav hakosov la'akiv. We'll say, what's the point of the repetition? The point of the repetition tells you that what? Not only is it lachatchila that you have to stand during the avodah, but what? It is ma'akev. That if you did not stand that what? Then what? Then the avodah is possible. Amar le Rav Nachman michti yoshev kizar dami. So we'll say, maybe I would say the following. I would say it's like this. Now that we just established that if you sit when doing the avodah, we'll say, then what happens? The avodah is possible. So essentially, you should say that when you sitting during the avodah is the equivalent to kizar dami umachal avodah. We'll say a kohen sitting to the avodah during the avodah is the equivalent of what? A non-kohen doing the avodah. Or meaning, just like if a non-kohen does the avodah, zar does the avodah is possible. So too, if a kohen sits, the avodah is possible as well. So therefore, I would have said ma'ema ma'zar b'misa. Af yoshev b'misa. So I would say that if you're going to tell me that if when you sit, the avodah is puzzle, so it's pretty much just like if the non-kohen does the avodah, that if you sit, it's puzzle. So I would say that just as if the non-kohen does the avodah, he's chayev misa, so too if the kohen sits during the avodah, he should be chayev misa as well. In other words, not only should the avodah be puzzle, but what Rabbi say, the kohen who sits should be chayev misa as well. But yet again, we learned alamatanya. But we learned about say aval orel onein yoshev einon b'misa ela ba'ashara. About say yet we learned that what? That if an orel, an uncircumcised kohen, or an onein, a kohen who's an avelus, or a kohen sits during the avodah, they're not liable to a death penalty. Rather, what? They're just in violation of a prohibition. So what say? I don't understand. Once you're telling me that a kohen who sits during the avodah is not good, then I would say that's the equivalent as if a zar, a non-kohen, did the avodah, and if a non-kohen does the avodah, is chayiv misa. So why don't we say that when you sit, if a kohen sits, just like the avodah is profane, he should also be chayiv misa? To which the Gemara says, we see that's not the case. We say that if a kohen sits during the avodah, although the avodah is pasul, the kohen is not chayiv misa. Watch this. To which the Gemara says, mishum dahavi mechusra begadim. Because Rabbi saying the Torah goes out of its way to speak about the case of mechusra begadim. Mechusra begadim is the kohen who does the avodah without the requisite big day kahuna, or rachos and raglayim means the kohen who does the avodah without washing his hands and his feet. The Torah says explicitly in both of those cases that what? That you're chayiv misa. Both say, you see, here's the general principle. In general, the Torah could have just said once that if you don't do the avodah in accordance with the prescribed divine plan, then what? You're chayiv misa. And what would that have taught me? That would have taught me that any deviation in the avodah, by definition, results in a liability for death, or a liability of death. The fact that the Torah goes out of its way to single out certain behaviors as being liable to a death penalty tells me that what? The death penalty only applies in those cases and not in others. This is the principle what the Torah calls shnei ksuvin habayim ke'echad in malamdin. So we'll say, in other words, when the Torah states something once, then what? This is actually very interesting. Then what? You could say the once serves as a paradigm, as a klal, and applies to all cases. When the Torah states something twice, then what is that saying? It's only specific for those cases that are stated. So the Gemara says, Torah goes out of its way to state the death penalty by mechusar begadim, and by a kohen who doesn't wash his hands and feet to tell me what? Shnei ksuvin habayim ke'echad, top of chav dalit. V'cho shnei ksuvin habayim ke'echad ein melamdin. What I just want to point out, we just went from chav beis amud beis to chav dalit amud aleph. in 48 minutes. I'm just saying. Okay, so I'll say, so again, so I'll say, so what's the halacha? The Torah goes out of its way to say that a Kohen who doesn't do the avodah or a Kohen who does the avodah without washing his hands and his feet is chayiv misa. The Kohen who goes ahead and does the avodah without what? Wearing the proper begadim is chayiv misa. Torah states that twice to teach you that what? The chayiv misa, Rabbi Osai, doesn't apply in any case of kohanic deviation, only in the specific cases. And therefore, therefore, what do we learn from here? Anytime Torah goes out of its way to state something multiple times, tells us it only applies in the cases in which it is stated and cannot be applied to the cases in which it's not stated. The Chiyav Misa Rabosai is only stated by specific cases of kohanic deviation. Where is it not stated? Where is it not stated? By yeshiva, by sitting. Which teaches me that a Kohen who sits by the avodah, as much as he is in violation of a lav, of a prohibition, is not chayiv misa. Watch this. Ulamandar melamdin, according to the one who says that even by shnei ksuvin abayin kechem melamdin, that if the Torah states something twice, you can still go ahead and learn out a principle from that. Nevertheless, shtuye yayin havile shlishi. So Rabbi say there's a third time the Torah speaks about the chayiv of misa. Rabbi say when is that? When is that? By drinking wine. Torah tells us that if a Kohen drinks wine before doing the avodah is chayiv misa, which also means that what? The Torah goes ahead and in 3 instances highlights a liability for misa, even if you don't subscribe to the principle of shnei ksuvin abayin ke'echad ein malamdin. Everyone agrees that what? That shlosha ksuvin abayin ke'echad ein malamdin. That if the Torah states something 3 times, everyone agrees that what? That you cannot create an overarching principle. Rather, the concept only applies in the stated specific circumstances. Therefore, again, Abosai, because the Torah goes out of its way to highlight the fact that a Kohen who drinks wine is chayiv misa, a Kohen who doesn't wash his hands and his feet is chayiv misa, a Kohen who does not wear the particular Kohanic vestments is chayiv misa, tells me that what? That it is only in situations of specific Kohanic deviation where there is a liability for misa. But any case of Kohanic deviation where there is no death penalty written, therefore what? There is no death penalty in effect. By the case of yeshiva, Torah goes out of its way to tell me that a Kohen has to stand, but what? The Torah does not tell me that if a Kohen who sits is chayiv misa, which then leads me to say what? That if a Kohen sits, as much as the avodah will be puzzle, the Kohen will not be chayiv misa. Shkach, let's stop here for today. It's still on.